Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn from today rainy North Germany, a very typical May, June day here, unfortunately. And I am joined today by a rather accomplished and out of the ordinary author today for the podcast interview. And for today, I have Thomas Helling with me. He is a doctor, and this time I mean a actual doctor, where, we sometimes have those jokes in the history community that somebody on the plane has a medical emergency and they're looking for a doctor, and we're raising our hands and like, nope, not the PhD. This is the MD type. Um, Thomas got his, or Thomas, he also goes by, I will stick with Tom, got his doctor at the University of Kansas, if I see this correctly. He has served in the um, Army Medical Corps for 9 years and is currently a professor of surgery at the University of Mississippi Medical Center in Jackson, Mississippi. But he is joining me from Kansas, where he is spending half of his time. And you might be like, why is he talking to a doctor? Because Tom actually has published quite a few books, among them The Healers, The Great War and the Birth of Modern Medicine, The Agony of Heroes, and the one we're talking about today from University Press of Mississippi, Sickly Vapors, Disease and Doctoring in the Old South. So first of all, Tom, thank you so much for taking a little time here out of your day to talk to me about your book. So, like I always like to start, tell me how this all began. How did you come to think of, oh, I want to write a book about medicine in the colonial and antebellum South?
Well, I'm a Midwesterner by birth, living most of my life in Kansas. Spent a little time in Western Pennsylvania before going to Mississippi. So when I went to Mississippi in 2009, it was a new experience
Hmm.
being in the South. Um, I have grown to like the South and deeply appreciate the people there.
Hmm.
Um, The there when you talk about the South, especially the deep South, Mississippi and Louisiana and Georgia, um, you're talking about an area where there is a feeling of distinctiveness.
Hmm.
That land and those people are different than Yankees in the North. And that kind of caught my attention early on. I tried to decipher that and figure what makes you guys distinctive, because really, when you look at Mississippi compared to Kansas, they in some ways are very similar.
Hmm.
It's primarily agricultural, small towns. The medical care is dispersed throughout. And they are not typically known for their technology or advancement in
Hmm.
scientific medicine. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of similarities. So I was trying to figure out, so why do you guys think you're distinct while people in Kansas kind of take it as a matter of fact that that's life? And I'm sure it has a lot to do with their history. And so I started to snoop around historically, and um, I figured that I should probably, if I'm going to write about this, I should write about a part of that distinctiveness that I know most about, which is medicine. So I took their distinctiveness and applied it to the medical field historically, and tried to then interpret why even in a health related environment they used to think of themselves as distinctive. Now they don't anymore. There's full assimilation into scientific thinking that occurs worldwide. So that's not an issue. But back before the Civil War, that period that we call the colonial period, the antebellum period, the decades immediately preceding the Civil War, they truly did feel that their land and their culture and their health problems
Mhm.
were distinctive. And so that's where I focused.
And it seems like from the books you have done that medicine is sort of the topic you like to write about and or the prisms through which you like to explore the past.
Well, you like to write what you know, and
Yeah.
I feature myself, of course, as an amateur historian. That some people may feel is arguable, but I enjoy it. I've always enjoyed history, even as a young adolescent. I enjoyed history topics, so that was nothing new. I have no formal training in history. I have no
Mhm.
advanced degree in history. I was not a major in history in college, but I've taken it on now. And I, first of all, not to digress too much, but if you want to do research in medicine, it is terribly dependent on funding. And
Mm,
the competition for research dollars is very keen.
mm,
In the field of surgery, for example, if you want to do research, you better have a PhD
mm,
because you're not going to be able to obtain much money simply as a physician.
oh,
So where is research cheap? Well, it's in history, medical
mhm,
history.
yeah,
Yes, it would be nice to have an advanced degree, but I don't believe that's necessary. Again, that's arguable. What I do believe is that the research involved in medical history is cheap and it's
mhm,
easy to do if you're willing to
uh-huh,
do a little digging, maybe
mm,
do a little traveling, but
mhm,
with the electronic age and with the internet, it's easy to access archives and other resources across the country. There are people more than willing to help and cooperate. So I find it an easy way to do at this
mhm.
point in my life to do medical research.
Yeah, and it's amazing. You're totally right. It's amazing what has been digitized in the last like 10 years. It's
Right.
incredible.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
it also makes me feel better because when I was still teaching in college, I oftentimes used medical professionals as sort of my argumentative line of like, why should you still be interested in history and the
Hmm.
research of
Hmm.
patients coming in, researching their medical history was one of the things that I brought up to them and was like, you know,
Well, medicine is a continuum of knowledge.
mhm,
Medical knowledge didn't stop with the discovery of germs and antibiotics
mhm,
and anesthesia. I mean, medicine as we practice it extends to antiquity.
mhm,
So it is a continuum of knowledge, and I think we as physicians should be aware of that
mhm,
when we try to interpret our current practices and why we do things and don't and we shouldn't feel so superior or special because 50 years from now
mhm,
there are going to be advancements where those people will look back at us and say how could they be so stupid, how
mhm.
could they be so naive, why didn't they see this?
Yeah.
Well, we build on one another,
Mhm.
and it is a continuum of
Mm.
knowledge in the care of patients. So
Which is actually a great lead over to your book on part because I would assume some more lay readers or even some medical professionals reading your book would chuckle or just roll their eyes at some of the things that you're writing about. But as you say, for the people that were practicing medicine at that time, it was like the gospel of the time.
that's all they knew. That's all they could decipher of the permutations of nature.
Mm,
Why did things happen to people? Why did they get sick?
mm,
Um, there were germs were unknown. Bacteriology was non-existent.
Yeah.
Who knew what causes this stuff? So it was a slow but steady process of inquiry
Hmm.
into the workings of nature.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And we'll explore that a lot more as we go and talk about your book because nature and medicine seem very closely related to one another in all of it. So the other part that I kind of was well, there's two parts. The first part was curious about is sort of like you picked an extremely long period to study,
Hmm.
right? I mean,
Hmm.
you're starting almost with the
Hmm.
first arrivals of white Europeans in America, and you're going
Hmm.
to through the Civil War, even into Reconstruction. So you're covering 250 years in
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
Um, what prompted you to do that? That seems really ambitious.
It was towards the end of the 19th century, particularly in the decades following the Civil War, there was sort of a revolution in science. There were new discoveries. The microscope was available.
Mm,
Germs had been identified. Bacteriology when it was in its early stages, and the in a surgical field, anesthesia became practical,
mm,
general anesthesia. So that allowed for more aggressive operations for diseases and disorders. And there was
mm,
also in that time a better understanding of what sickness was.
mm,
There was some recognition that sickness was not necessarily something that affected the entire body or could be really handled by the older concepts. It became apparent that sickness was oftentimes affecting one particular organ or another in a predictable, sometimes
mm,
way. So they sort of revised our concept of what disease
mm,
was. So what I tried to do is look at the history of disease and doctoring in those decades and
mm,
centuries before that happened, focusing again on the southern part of America, the southern colonies, and then the southern southeast United States, um, and to see how those people at that time interpreted these illnesses before there was any real understanding of what they were. Again,
mm,
going back to this continuum, though, it was necessary to sort of go through those phases to reach an understanding of what truly what disease was. And you know what? Even in the present day, we're still our understanding is still evolving. So we don't
mm.
believe for a minute that we have all the answers. So
Mm. It would be, I guess, bad if we thought we did.
yeah, right.
Uh, the other part that I kind of like, it's fascinating. It's like you're taking on so much, and it's incredible how you just concisely communicated all of that information in the little space that the press gave you. And on top of that, what also impressed me was sort of like the way you wrote, the kind of the prose that you brought to it. It's very accessible. It wasn't heavy on jargon. It was very beautiful in many places, the way it was written. So is it like when you're doing surgeries that you're kind of thinking in your mind, or when you're like sleeping, going to bed, that you're thinking about like the word choices, or like doing sports? Like how do you like do you edit like 15 times to kind of find the best word choice?
Oftentimes, I've done a lot of scientific writing too, and there's sort of a format for that, and
Mm-hmm.
you're writing for fellow professionals, and you have a limited amount of space, and you've got to get your ideas across very
Mm-hmm.
succinctly. Okay, so that's one form of writing, and I get that. That's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But when I envision myself writing for a broader readership, I want to be able to converse with them in a way that I would like we're doing right now. And
Mm,
when and to take that even further, when I'm talking to patients about their problems or about what I'm going to
mm,
do, I try to steer clear of technology, at
mm,
least that which I think they probably don't understand, and try to put this in terms that conversational terms that we would have
mm,
over dinner,
mm,
or in the backyard, trying to explain something or other. And I think so oftentimes patients are just bewildered by what you're telling them and don't understand most of it. And I didn't want my readership
mm.
in these books to feel the same way. I mean, they're gonna put it down after a page or two, and that'll
Right.
be the end of it. And so I tried to make that my approach that kind of a conversational approach about these issues. When I read historical work, um, I enjoy that kind of approach. I
Mm,
enjoy reading as if the author is telling me a story,
mhm,
and the better storyteller they are, the more fascinated I am, and
mm.
I just get immense enjoyment out of that kind of literature. So.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that will be my approach doing this. Is it perfect? No. Do I
Mm.
evolve? I hope so. So anyway.
Like, just as a side note, how many of your patients know that you're a writer?
Not very many. I,
Not
you
many.
know, it's not something that I publicize. Uh, it's still a hobby.
Hmm.
I haven't given up my day job. I don't think I ever will or should. But it's a hobby, and
Hmm.
if they find out about it, that's fine. I will talk about it. I'll sign their books if it ever comes to that or whatever.
So you
But
have
I, do-
patients that come in with a book and are like, "Are you
Oh,
this guy?"
probably once or twice,
Yeah.
actually, once or twice. Nothing beyond that. So, I, it's not that I try to hide it.
Mm.
It's not what I want to talk about with
Sure.
them. I
Sure.
want to talk about their problems and
Right.
what we're going to do to take care of them.
Well,
So.
yeah, it's more like, oh, I have this doctor. I've seen that book on the shelf somewhere,
Well, then
like,
I'll launch into a brief
yeah,
discussion of my hobby.
yeah.
So.
Maybe after this, there will be more people all of a sudden like real talking about it with you.
Well,
We'll see.
you can only hope, right?
Um, so, ooh, so where do we start? Because there's so much in there. So I guess the big topics that you have in your book is with regard to sort of the medical treatment, the medical education, and sort of where people thought some of the problems were coming from. And it felt, or it, one of the things that you're pointing out was that a lot of people that got sick blamed the environment, both climate and soil, for a lot of their ailments. Um, so why do you feel that was?
Well, back in the back in colonial times in the 1700s, and even before maybe, there were certainly health issues throughout the continental United States or the continental America,
Mm,
however limited it was to the East Coast. There were certainly health problems
mm,
far and wide.
mm,
As settlers migrated south into the Carolinas from Virginia and into areas now called Georgia and eventually along the Gulf Coast, they began to first of all encounter a different climate.
mhm,
There was a climate that was generally warmer. The winters were shorter. The air was more humid.
mhm,
There were expanses of marshland, what
mhm,
they call in the Carolinas low country.
mhm,
Um, and they found that along with that climate change, they began to experience illnesses
mhm,
that seemed to be more severe than they had been even in Virginia or
mhm,
Maryland or Pennsylvania or the New England area. Um, and they actually it was so dangerous that they were for a while warning settlers to migrate with caution because there were definite risks to health by moving into these places. Now, the seduction was, of course, that the
Mm,
agricultural opportunities were just outstanding. The soil was so fertile and the growing season long, and they began to recognize that growing certain crops started in Virginia as tobacco,
mm,
and once into the Carolinas, rice,
mhm,
indigo, and cotton. And these were what was more important about these crops was the export value,
mhm,
the worldwide demand, first of all for tobacco, and then for indigo and cotton,
mhm,
rice. And so it was an enticement, despite the dangers of health, to get
mhm,
into these areas to develop wide sections of farms they call plantations, and to reap considerable wealth
mhm,
in growing these crops and then exporting them worldwide, basically through England, of course,
mhm,
during the colonial times, but distributed almost worldwide. So the South became an area of great affluence, despite the health issues, great affluence. Unfortunately, it spawned a sort of a deplorable labor market in slavery, which began, of course, to haunt the South until emancipation, 100 plus years later. Now, for the health risk, indeed, there was some danger. It was clear that, well, let me uh, provide some backstory here. What were the health concerns of colonials throughout America? Well, of course, we didn't recognize disease as we do now. We didn't recognize what smallpox really was. We didn't recognize what malaria was. We didn't recognize what yellow fever was or measles. We just knew these were afflictions that happened in great numbers sometimes. What was the common symptom for all of these? It was fever.
mhm,
And fever was the dominant worrisome development in anyone's health.
mhm,
The fever could be short lived, as in a case of the common cold, or it could be a disaster in the case of advanced stages of malaria or yellow fever. So, fever was something that everybody recognized as a state of ill health. And of course, associated with fever are oftentimes other symptoms that more or less group these febrile illnesses into certain recognizable conditions.
mhm,
For example, the fever of smallpox, the appearance of spots on the skin and
mhm,
pustules was characteristic of that condition. With malaria, the periodic fever was important to recognize. A fever that occurred every 2 days or 3 days, accompanied by bone rattling chills, and of course, in severe cases, of mental disturbances, seizures, and death. Yellow fever was often called bilious fever because yellow fever, of course, affected the liver, which
mhm,
produced jaundice, which could be seen in the whites of the eyes and the
mhm,
skin. So the colonists were aware, the physicians of the time and the
mhm,
layperson even were aware that a constellation of these symptoms could indicate a certain condition, and
mhm,
people knew that that particular condition had a certain prognosis.
mhm,
It seemed like in the South, as people migrated there, that these same conditions these periodic fevers, the bilious fever, some of these other manifestations of illness, such as diarrhea,
mm,
vomiting, and so forth, rashes, seem to be a little bit more prevalent in the South and in some cases much more severe.
mm,
Now, of course, that prompted people to think, well, it must be this unique climate and
mm,
this unique landscape
right,
that is responsible for these
mm,
more virulent illnesses.
mm,
Um, and much, in fact, much of the research, much of the doctors in the South, of course, were not as scientifically oriented as
mm,
those in the major cities of the North, such as Philadelphia, New York, or Boston. Um, what they did try to investigate was this exact premise that let's try to define what in the environment is worse here for health than
mm,
in the Pennsylvania or New
mm,
York or Massachusetts. So a lot of their work when they did do research was
mm,
in that realm. So and actually, as the Southern culture evolved, their focus on export crops such as cotton, tobacco, rice, the demand for slave labor and
mm,
getting this done and of course, this was an era before mechanization. There was no other way
okay,
to export cotton besides people going out into the fields and manually picking it, and
mhm,
that's extremely hard work. Um, so they knew that in order to keep this export business up, in order to keep up this affluence, this wealth,
mhm,
they had to have slave labor and
mhm,
a lot of it. They tried. I can tell you, this all started in Virginia back in the late 1600s, early 1700s with a tobacco crop,
mhm,
and the people that settled Virginia brought with them not slaves, but what they called indentured servants. These were white folks who would, for a period of time, function. Their way was paid over
mhm,
to the colonies. Their room and board was basically paid, and they would work for a period of time for their master before they were released to go out and buy their own land. It was a definite period of time, and they were called indentured servants. And so this worked pretty well in Virginia for a while until indenturement expired, and the planters noticed that their help was leaving, and they eventually migrated to the Carolinas. But they were stuck with this huge,
mhm,
expansive land trying to produce tobacco to export, and their help was gone.
mhm,
And that's why they started relying on slave labor because the slaves were stuck. They were captured.
mhm,
They were basically bonded. There's no way out, and indenturement was not an issue. And that sort of migrated down the southern coast and into the deep south as the cheapest and most efficient form of labor. They tried, some of these planters tried the Native American tribes, but the natives were too clever.
mhm,
They said, yeah, after a bit of that, they said, we know this land better than the colonists do,
mhm,
so we're just going to be gone, and they're never going to find us. So the colonists quickly realized the Native Americans were not the best labor force. It was these captured um, Africans who were totally removed from their homeland. They had no way to get back. They were
mhm,
basically stuck. So, so that kind of attitude that spilled into a thought that we are distinctive in the South.
mhm,
We are different. Uh, our economy is different. Our way of life is different. Um, our labor force is different.
mhm,
But you guys in the North don't understand that. I mean, if you want all of the raw material that we produce here to develop in the North and ship as exports, textile industry, basically,
Mm-hmm.
then you're going to have to rely on us and how our economy works. Because, you know, it's basically we're feeding the nation or the colonies. And if you don't like what we do, then you're going to suffer economically from it. So just put up with it. We are distinctive. And in the health field, the same thing happened. They thought,
Mm-hmm.
well, the physicians, assimilating to Southern culture because a lot of the physicians came from the North, felt the same way. Okay, so yeah, our health issues are distinctive too. They
Mm-hmm.
were in part right. They were.
Mm-hmm.
But our health issues are distinctive. So we're part of this Southern distinctiveness. And it became a regional culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Uh, there were a lot of things in there that I could want to pick up on some level, but it's very clear that the climate has a major impact here. And a lot of people thought soil as well. So, like as a physician yourself, do you agree that soil can have an impact on a person's health?
Well, the thinking back in those days, before anybody knew anything about bacteria or
Hmm.
parasite, anything, they wondered what kind of vapors, and of
Hmm.
course that sort of ties into the name of the book, sickly vapors. What kind of vapors
Right.
were arising from these lowland
Hmm.
marshes and stagnant water, and the effects of the sun, that are more pronounced than in New England,
Hmm.
um, the longer summers and the humidity. They felt that these were creating toxic vapors
Hmm.
that were causing these fevers and these conditions. Um, were they right? Well, you might kind of smirk at that in 21st century America. That, well, how would they think that? But in part, they were right. Um, And here's the interesting thing, and I don't really go into this much in the book. The In part, this was due to the import of slaves. The Africans brought with them three distinct uh, illnesses. They brought yellow fever, to which they had become immune. The yellow fever and the virus that causes it was native to sub-Saharan Africa,
Hmm.
and many of the African slaves were immune to it, but they brought the virus with them, and before long, it became a major health issue throughout the colonies, but particularly in the South because of a greater number of carriers. They also brought a particular form of malaria with them called falciparum malaria. There are many kinds of protozoa that cause malaria, but the falciparum variety is the most severe. And so Africans brought that with them, and developed a degree of immunity as well from that. The mosquitoes, the Anopheles mosquitoes, would bite these Africans, pick up a little bit of the protozoa, and the next bite would be on a white guy, and who then caught the disease. And falciparum malaria is the most common cause of death in malaria, a type of malaria. So, indeed, the forms of periodic fever in the South became, in fact, much more virulent than in the North because of this particular strain of uh, of malaria. And they brought a hookworm with them. And hookworm is an intestinal parasite, a worm, and causes, of course, significant problems with anemia and malnutrition and sickly behavior. So, in part, the not the not the environment, but the South was a little bit worse health wise because of these factors. that the
Right.
North didn't necessarily appreciate. Now, yellow fever was still seen in the North.
Hmm.
There were bad outbreaks in Philadelphia, for example, but in the South it seemed a little bit more prevalent.
Yeah. No, but you actually took the question right out of my mouth because hookworm was one of the things I wanted to ask you about because for those that have listened to the podcast a while, I just a few weeks ago I had Andrew Parnell who wrote a book about Walter Hines Page on, and one of the big medical accomplishments in his publishing career was kind of the eradication of the hookworm in the late 19th century in the South. So it's the
Hmm.
soil definitely kind of having an impact
Hmm.
there. And
Hmm.
of course, mosquitoes, st hot climate, standing water, a lot of
Absolutely.
sunshine. The
Yeah,
South
so
is a breeding ground.
right, so it made breeding of these mosquitoes much more prevalent than in other areas of the country, colder climates. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh no, it's a
But you know,
nightmare.
in part, yes, there was a reason for the severe illnesses in the South. In
Hmm.
part, there was.
Right.
In another way of looking at it, maybe not entirely, and maybe doctors sort of read a little bit of this distinctiveness into the medical field too.
Right.
Um,
Yes. Which is a
so
big part of your book.
yeah, so I'm not convinced that it was all that distinctive. Um, I just think that eventually this whole momentum of Southern sectionalism
Mm.
incorporated
Hmm.
the health field as well as other areas such as farming and so forth.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, when you were talking about fevers, I was thinking of like, I mean, I'm a parent. When my first kid was born, and the first fever, you're going all crazy because you're like, oh,
Hmm.
what is this? What can I give
Hmm.
them? How can I help in any
Hmm.
shape or form?
hmm
You're super concerned about it. So I can see in a
hmm
even less medically developed time, people going crazy about like, what's this fever doing? What could it do? What could happen to the person, the loved one that is suffering from it? I mean,
there were two major theories about what they called diseases or conditions. Um, One theory was that it was the environment.
hmm
The environment interacted with the internal machinery of the body. And in colonial times and through some of the 19th century, those conditions were generally referred to as the humors, the
hmm
four humors, yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. That dated from antiquity, from ancient times,
hmm
and so there was an environmental effect on those internal humors that was unique, pretty much unique from patient to patient.
hmm
Um, but that was the interaction that caused the illness.
hmm
The other theory was that these illnesses were actually passed from person to person or
hmm
animal to person, so that it sort of travel. And so when someone became ill, the best thing to do was to get them away from everybody else. So we call quarantine.
Yeah.
And for a while, like for example, with this yellow fever scare or the smallpox scare, any ship that came into port,
hmm
and the major port in the south, the major port in the south in colonial times was Charleston. And any ship that came into port, the crew were quarantined for a period of time, maybe even a
hmm
few weeks before they were allowed on
hmm
shore.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be safe. Better safe than sorry in
Right,
those
right.
cases. And
So, and in fact, both theories proved basically right. There
yeah.
there was an effect of the environment via
hmm
microorganisms, viruses, bacteria, and so forth. And
hmm
there also was a contagion part of disease
hmm
transmission. So the treatment then
hmm
kind of followed those lines. The humoral theory produced a whole host of remedies that were designed to either rid the body of excess humors or resupply it. And they were probably more harmful than the illness itself. These various things to make
hmm
people vomit and diarrhea, purgatives, diarrhea.
hmm
and other horrible applications that just made everybody sicker. The other approach was to relieve the body of its hyperactivity, particularly hyperactive blood flow,
Mm-hmm.
which was thought to produce inflammation and illness. So the major technique there was bloodletting,
Mm-hmm.
which was practiced far and wide, and sometimes almost to the point of exsanguination. Blistering, creating blisters on the skin that then, once they formed, were popped and drained, producing, I guess, eradicating extra serum or evil humors or something. But neither one, of course, really worked very well, other than making people even worse. So,
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the kind of remedies that were being used. So, as a medical professional, which one did you feel like these doctors using in the past was the worst for the patient? Like, was it bloodletting or was it like,
bloodletting,
okay.
bloodletting. It was something. I mean, there were, one of the most famous American physicians of that time, a man by the name of Benjamin Rush, who was actually a
Hmm.
signer of the Declaration of Independence, was a big proponent of bloodletting. He
Hmm.
would bleed people, probably. We all carry around about 5 quarts of blood or so, and he would bleed people half that volume sometimes, which would, of course, horribly deplete a person, and even to the point that they could go into shock and conceivably die.
Right.
So, but he was a big proponent of bloodletting. He
Hmm.
felt that was a remedy for many of these illnesses. The I'll tell you, the remedy that made a difference, though, believe it or not, there was a particular tree in Peru
Hmm.
that the Native Americans identified and would take the bark out of it, of the tree, powderize it, and give it as a medication for fever. And in some cases, they saw that it worked.
Hmm.
Well, the Spanish colonists got wind of this, got some of this stuff, and shipped it back to Europe. And in fact, for some of these fevers, it seemed to take the fever away. Some of these periodic fevers. And this was a powder that the natives called quina. And what that turned out to be in modern terminology is quinine. And of course, quinine is very effective against malaria, against the protozoa that cause malaria. And in fact, that was a curative a remedy
Hmm.
for fevers, the periodic fevers of malaria. Now, it didn't work if you had influenza or smallpox or anything else, but for malaria, which was prevalent in all the Americas, um, it could be very effective.
Hmm. Um, Before we go to the Native American side, since you brought up Benjamin Rush, I want your opinion, your professional opinion on his Sanderclappers. Like
Oh,
the
anyway,
Sunderclappers. He had a pill that was 50% mercury, contained a few other things beyond that, that was sort of Lewis and Clark got it on there, true or to the American
well,
West with them.
mercurial poisoning was a real danger with some of these medications. They were touted to be, of course, curative for various disorders, but mercury poisoning was the usual result of that.
Okay, so don't use them. It
Don't use
kills
them.
you.
No, no, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of what I thought was happening there. On the other hand, you do talk a little about surgery as well. Some of these early surgeries that some doctors attempted, but you indicate that a lot of doctors don't want to do surgery because they feel it is extremely dangerous. And how do you feel about like them doing surgery on the kitchen table in the house of the patient? Would you like?
Well, I wouldn't advise that. But back in the day, let me tell you something about American surgery. The people that came over in colonial days that populated New England, and eventually Virginia and further south, were the doctors. were oftentimes locally trained, and we can talk
Mm,
about that in a bit. Very few of them had any formal education
hmm
in Europe. Many of them came over as surgeon mates, which means they were assistant
mm,
surgeons on board ship or
right,
actually ship surgeons. And once they got here, they set up a medical practice of sorts. Now, um, for a while, they competed with religious ministers
mm,
who seemed to be about as smart as they were, if not smarter.
mm,
And but it became a practice in America as opposed to Europe of a comparable period that physicians, when they became, even after they became formally educated, physicians would not just practice medicine or surgery, they would do both. In
mm,
Europe, already by the 1800s, there
mm,
was a dichotomy medicine and surgery. So people
mm,
practice mostly medicine, the academic types at universities, and then the surgeons, a
mm,
little less formally educated, but still very useful.
mm,
In America, that was not the case.
mm,
Physicians did medicine and surgery combined, and of course, that certainly carried over into the
mm,
South with a rural environment, small towns.
mm.
The physician was capable of doing not only medicine and surgery, but obstetrics,
We should put
kind of
air
a
quotes
jack of all
about quote.
trades. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, of course, there was a reluctance to do anything very adventurous surgically.
Hmm
The major problem was that for a while, until the mid 1800s, there was no such thing as general anesthesia.
hmm
So if you were to operate on someone, you did that with them fully awake, or maybe with a slug of alcohol or opium. But
hmm
how obtunded they were for that is anybody's guess. Anyway, and so where did these procedures take place? Well, the hospitals were not really a place people wanted to go. They were oftentimes filled with beggars and poor and destitute types. They were dirty and poorly attended in terms of nursing care. So most people got their medical care at home, even in the North and the South. That was your primary care base, and so surgery no different. If you needed something cut out, it was done on the kitchen table. Um, in fact, I think there was an attempt or two to do remove female ovaries on the
hmm
kitchen table. So, but surgery was not something people embraced. As a physician, it was a sure way to ruin your reputation. I mean, all you had to do is try to operate on a few people, they died, and suddenly you had no people, no clientele.
Yeah.
So there was some reluctance to do that.
I can't even imagine.
Well, it was pretty gruesome.
Oh.
There are stories. There was one operation. I don't think I included it in the book, but a pretty well-known operation for breast cancer,
Mm,
mastectomy, and it was really kind of a sad condition because if surgery wasn't done, the cancer itself would progress and involve the skin and end up
mm,
as a very smelly, unsavory condition until the patient died, which might be years later.
mm,
So it was the feeling was that mastectomies needed to be done, and on the kitchen table more than once in the literature is a
mm,
story of a woman who had to subject herself to this type of operation, removing the breast
mm,
uh, without anesthesia,
mm.
and I cannot imagine something more painful. So
Yeah. No, and also deadly, I assume, considering the pain
sometimes,
and
yeah,
bleeding
sometimes,
involved.
right.
I
Yeah,
mean,
no blood transfusions. Yeah, you were if
oh,
you couldn't stop bleeding, it was curtains.
yikes. Oh my God. Ah, ooh, ooh. So. Yeah, let's turn to, I mean, we kind of talked already about sort of the lack of medical care in the frontier environments, but and you already hinted at, and I think we should cover that the education that doctors received and like at which point do we kind of see an like slight improvement of like the or professionalization, I guess would be the better term of the medical profession in the South.
Well, for a while, any doctor going to practice in the South, and there were obviously many that did
Mm,
receive their medical training in the North, and
mm,
the only centers of medical education of any repute were in Boston and New York and Philadelphia. And
mm,
the Southern people, if they were going to get a formal education, tended to migrate to Philadelphia as their
mm,
preference. Some to New York, but many to Philadelphia.
mm,
And of course, that's where Benjamin Rush was a major educator.
mm,
And once they were educated, they then might move back to the South. Now, as the years went by into the 1800s, this Southern distinctiveness became more of a topic,
mm,
and the peculiarity of
mm,
Southern climate
mm,
and diseases became more of a topic.
mm,
So that and so there was I think this was part of a general feeling of Southern exclusivity,
mm,
that the South was different than the North
mm,
in all aspects, and the doctors began to think, well, then in medical training, it's going to have to be different
right,
because we have diseases here that you don't see in the
mm,
North. We have slave labor here and their
mm,
particular diseases. You don't see that much in the North.
right,
So why shouldn't our students be educated in the South instead of going to the North? And just before
mm,
the Civil War, of course, going to the North meant being subjected to the
mm,
harassment of Yankees uh, uh, proselytizing against slavery.
mm,
And of course, they didn't want that kind of propaganda influencing these students as they came back home. So there was an effort then to start medical education in the South itself. The first attempt to do that actually was at Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He developed a medical course there. Now, medical education in those days, you might consider was different than today. Medical education meant maybe 5 or 6 weeks of classroom study, some personal reading, and if you then you found a physician that you could apprentice with until he thought you were capable of independent practice.
I mean, think of
Now,
that. When I read that, I was like, oh my God, think of medical education today. It's like 5, 6 years of classroom and theory
right,
and then
right, and
residence and
right now some, and there was no in those days, high
Mm,
school education was equivalent now to our college education. So
right.
uh, very few of these people even went to college. They were
Mm,
right out of high school. They tried to buy their way into a medical school, get their several weeks of indoctrination,
mhm,
and then try to find an apprentice,
mm,
person to apprentice with.
right.
Now, there were a few schools that were a little more rigorous than that, but not very many.
Mm,
And very few were actually affiliated with hospitals.
mm,
And that was what was unique about the Philadelphia program, in that it was affiliated with the Pennsylvania Hospital,
mm,
founded by Benjamin Franklin back in the 1700s. So,
mm,
but they had access then to sick patients that they could actually see and be at the bedside
mhm,
with and examine. That wasn't generally the case. And so University of Virginia in Charlottesville was the first attempt to formally designate a curriculum in medicine.
mhm,
The University of South Carolina, the Medical College of South Carolina, developed in the 1830s, I believe, with a similar program, limited amount of classroom education, and some effort to involve one of the local Charleston
mm,
hospitals to actually see sick patients and be at the bedside and examine them and see how they're cared for and that type of thing. Um, there was an attempt in Augusta, Georgia, the medical later to be called the Medical College of Georgia, which is still there, to do the same thing. So there were pockets of medical education. When you look at the larger, there weren't many large cities in the South up to
Mhm.
the Civil War. Of course, Richmond, Virginia, which ended up being the capital of the Confederacy, but
Mm.
Charleston, South Carolina, major seaport, Savannah, sort of, and then you go around the Coast and you get to New Orleans,
Mhm.
major import-export city. And inland, that's about it. There was no
Okay.
Atlanta, Georgia.
Mhm.
Very small town by the time of the Civil War. There was a very small Nashville, Tennessee,
Mhm.
and that was it for large cities. And of course, you can imagine that for medical education and taking in students and getting faculty to actually live there and teach them and have any clinical
Mhm.
material at all, you've got to have at least a sizable population, even for the time, a sizable population. So there weren't many opportunities. So you had Charlottesville, which was kind of an anomaly because it was a very small
Mhm.
town, but you had Thomas Jefferson's influence. Richmond eventually had a medical school. Charleston had a medical school. Augusta had a medical school eventually. These are all before the Civil War.
Mhm.
And then New Orleans actually had two medical schools
Mhm.
before the Civil War, both of which used this famous hospital called Charity Hospital, which even back in the day was something to behold, I guess. Uh, Absolutely packed with sick patients, and
Mhm.
it was sort of one of the prized teaching hospitals
Mhm.
in the antebellum era.
Mhm.
So that's what you had, it and of course it encouraged the Southern students to stay in the South.
Mhm.
And then I think probably by 1860 there was a mass exodus of Southern medical students from the North back to the South,
Mhm.
yeah, and educated there.
Yeah, and I found it like I lived in Georgia for a few years, and I've been to Charleston a few times, and it's always fascinating when you're like you go to Charleston and you're on the peninsula, and there's the South Carolina Medical, right?
Hmm.
The Medical University of South Carolina. And it's not in
Hmm.
Columbia, it's in Charleston of all
Right,
places.
right, right,
You want to go to UGA, it's a big school in the state for medicine. In Georgia? No, you're not going to Atlanta. You're not going to
right,
Athens. You have to go to Augusta.
right,
And it's sort of
right,
interesting to see those antebellum legacies
right,
continue.
right.
But at the same time, it was fascinating that this was the work of doctors and medical professionals in these towns establishing and seeing the need for a medical education.
Yeah, these were private practitioners
Yeah.
that decided that they were visionary people. They said particularly in New Orleans,
Mm,
Erasmus Fenner and Thomas Hunt
mm,
and Warren Stone were just uh, general practitioners who decided to go to New Orleans because of all the diseases they heard about in
mm,
New Orleans. And they
mm,
got there and they saw, oh my God, there's no ability to care for all of these sick
mm,
people here. There's no medical education to even educate future doctors. The Charity Hospital was
mm,
just at its beginning as a public hospital or refuge for the sick and the
mm,
homeless and the poor. And they took it upon themselves, in addition to their caring for the sick, they took it upon themselves to organize a teaching faculty,
mm,
people that could actually volunteer their time to teach,
mm,
some kind of structure, administrative structure to kind of govern the place and select the students
mm,
and began this process of medical education. And they were, and both of these schools that formed in New Orleans were quite successful and
mhm.
they're still in existence, Tulane and LSU.
Yeah. And New Orleans sort of reminded me of like one of the first podcast episodes I did was with Karen Bell and Creole New Orleans, and one of the things she talks about in her book was how many of these Creole doctors from New Orleans having French ties actually went to Paris for education. So it seemed like there's a stark difference between the more cosmopolitan New Orleans, where doctors are more willing to go to metropole France and be like, okay, let's see what's the newest trends in medicine is versus
Mhm.
Charleston or Augusta, where it's like, no, we're distinct. We're not. We
Right.
don't need that.
Yeah, there wasn't much traveling to Europe. No. Mm-mm. The French in New Orleans, of course, were sort of resented
Hmm.
these guys, these non-French
Mm.
physicians who came in like Warren Stone and Erasmus Fenner. That wasn't sitting very well with their
Mm.
more cosmopolitan approach, with their ties to academic Paris.
Yeah.
Um, so they never did fully buy into
Hmm.
these medical schools.
Right. Uh, Associated with it, so that was the other part that I found fascinating was that you see the creation of medical societies
Mhm.
and actually they're publishing about
Well,
their
that's right. Fenner felt this physician in New Orleans. He Erasmus Fenner is an interesting guy. He practiced for a while in Mississippi, which was
mm,
back in those days, just at the very beginning of the cotton agriculture,
hmm
but a lot of wasteland. Yeah, and
mm,
he practiced there for a while, then went to New Orleans. And first thing he did, he realized how bad medical care was there. The
mm,
first thing he did, he said, I've got to get doctors together
mm,
and form a society where we can meet and discuss medical problems, and
mm,
even a journal that will publish
hmm
our practice and our
mm,
findings and our treatments in, just like they do in the North.
mm,
And there were other attempts like that in some of the other cities, whether it be Augusta or Charleston, or
mm,
that to try to bring practitioners together and share knowledge, so that you
mm,
don't have to go to New York, or you don't have to go to Philadelphia anymore. You could read our own literature, and you
mm,
can you can see our own experiences in our distinctive Southern culture and our distinctive Southern medicine.
mm,
So this had great appeal, and actually, it was a good thing. It was a good thing. Any
mm.
ability to organize and disseminate knowledge is always a good thing.
So, two-part question. How many of those medical journals did you read for the book? And how many times did the hairs on the back of your neck stand up when you read through articles and some?
Well, here I know we're going to go down a path here in about a minute. I read a number of them, and of course, the medical literature at the time was more of case reports.
Hmm.
An individual patient. This is what happened. A patient came to me with a tumor on the neck, and
Hmm.
and I took it off, and rarely did people even at the microscope was just in its infancy then,
Hmm.
so people weren't even looking through the microscope to see what the disease actually was. Um, there, in terms of the medical literature in the South, there is a particular physician by the name of Samuel Cartwright. Samuel Cartwright was born in Mississippi, I believe. Practiced for a while. He trained in Philadelphia, practiced in Mississippi, and then came to Louisiana. And
Mm,
Samuel Cartwright was a rabid racist.
mm,
His intent, and now he actually was a very smart guy, and some of what he wrote about was well received by
mm,
by physicians throughout the United States. He
mm,
was post-colonial days, and he was well respected in many areas, but he launched into these diatribes
mm,
on the justification of the African and African American in slavery.
mm,
And he wrote these outlandish reports of the difference in skull size and the difference in physiognomy,
mm,
the difference in gait, and the difference in lung size, and all in an attempt to create black inferiority
mm,
and justification for slavery. And those reports I read were completely out of bounds. Um, so that was probably the most interesting and
mm,
disturbing
mm,
of these antebellum reports that I read. Samuel Cartwright eventually was an official in the Confederate government in health matters,
mm,
but died in 1963 before the war ended. Despite all of these, and some of these reports, you might imagine for abolitionists were crazy stuff.
mm,
Nevertheless, a lot of what he also wrote was they felt credible and
mm,
legitimate and informative
mm,
and valuable.
right. Yeah, that's oh, yeah. You have to
Is what it is. Yeah,
yeah, you have
yeah.
to kind of select of like I can't read the pseudoscience racism, but there's one or two
Pseudoscience.
good
Yeah,
pieces that I can use in there that might still be beneficial. Um,
yeah, yeah. It was pseudoscience and very detrimental. And
mm,
I think it furthered the justification of slavery, but it was all
sure.
erroneous, incorrect,
Hmm.
biased.
Right.
Yeah. It shows you what can be done with false
Mm.
information.
Yes.
So,
Yes. We definitely know that in our time these days.
right, right.
Uh, so you do have a lot on the wars too, and a couple of different wars and medical treatment. But before we get there, I want one small little detour because you do, especially in one of your colonial chapters, you actually do talk about Native American and Native American um, remedies. And it was very interesting because you had a lot of people, medical practitioners who are like, nah, that it's Native American, it's not useful. And then you have a lot of people on the frontiers who are like, well, there's no doctors, so let's see if it works. And in many cases, it does work.
Hmm, hmm, hmm. The Native Americans, of course, had their own healing practices that, of course, varied from tribe to
Mm,
tribe. They were there. There were a lot of herbal
mm,
medicines they developed, and of course, this quina.
mm,
They eventually called this bark of that cinchona tree. They called it Jesuits bark because the
mm,
Jesuit missionaries actually were the ones who carried it back to Europe and
mm,
demonstrated its efficacy for periodic fevers. Anyway, so that was certainly something that Native Americans developed. But they had a lot of other herbal remedies that probably were no more effective than mainstream medicine at the time. They use there were some reports from some of the white settlers that they were a little better at
mm,
applying medication to heal wounds.
mm,
Some of these poultices and plasters that they put on wounds seem to facilitate healing. Here and there, they developed a remedy that seemed to be somewhat effective.
mhm,
Angelica was one of those that the Native Americans developed that were seemed to be good for dysentery, which is
mm,
diarrhea. But by and large, they were no more effective than any other medication. Nevertheless, people desperate for a remedy would seek these people out, seek these
mhm,
shamans out, and try it. The problem was that doctors were just kind of unreliable in terms of the quality of care you were going to get,
right.
and sometimes not available. If you lived in a remote area, there may not be a doctor. And
Mm,
so what you did was you sought out, you either used folk medicine
mhm,
that you learned around the household, you sought out midwives if that was appropriate, or
mm,
you use Native Americans were always nearby. You just kind
mhm,
of popped into their little encampment and said, who's the doctor here, and
mm,
and how can you help me? So, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm living in Germany, and a lot of Germans love homeopathic medicine. So it's something that's somewhat still with us, right? Of like, well, I
Right.
don't
Well, I
trust.
mean, I think there's a lot to be said about domestic household medicine,
Mm,
or at least health measures
right.
that have value, and
Hmm.
whether how we obtain those and how they developed is many times not scientific. It just
Right.
seems to be a way to placate the ill person until nature can heal.
Placebos work.
That's right. Well, the smart doctor back in the day, back in the colonial times and times before the Civil War, the
Mm,
smart doctor probably the best approach was to take pain away,
hmm.
and he always had opium to do that,
Yeah.
um, or alcohol.
Hmm.
And the other smart thing a doctor might want to do is just give nature a chance. Now, it's remarkable how healing or comforting the the presence of a medical professional is.
Hmm.
Sitting at the bedside, holding a pulse, uh, kind of nodding like somehow he knows what's going on. Maybe giving a little opium if you're in
Mm,
pain. But basically letting nature heal,
mm,
and basically that's really all that happened anyway, quite
mm,
frankly. And oftentimes nature did heal.
right.
Sometimes not, but oftentimes they did. But
Yeah.
but the best approach when you look at what really happened day to day and what
Mm,
most doctors did, they weren't the off the wall types like Cartwright. They were mostly just saying, I think you're going to be fine.
mm,
I'll come back in a few days. Let's let nature
mm,
heal things. Make sure the patient's warm. Make sure they get enough rest, make sure there's good ventilation, a lot of fresh
hmm.
air, those types of things that we still practice today around the household.
Yeah. Yeah. That and it still works on some level. Of
Right.
course, we do need
That's
people like
that.
you who do surgery every now and then.
Well, we do, yeah, and there's a place for that too. But yeah, that's part of the continuum of medical science.
Right.
So
Like, there's no point of coming to the hospital and blocking the ER with the cold.
that's true.
That's
That's true.
that's like how it sometimes like these days goes.
Yeah,
Uh,
and you're going to spend a lot of time sitting
I don't think you do, but
there.
your colleagues do.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
So now you, goodness, you have the Revolutionary War, you have the War of 1812, and you have the American Civil War as conflicts in your books that are part of your coverage chronologically. So let me start with this. If I were a soldier, which war did I definitely not want to get wounded in?
Uh, I would say all of them.
Oh, that
I don't
sucks.
think there is any. I don't think there is any improvement. Well, let me explain. What the Civil War did was organize evacuation of wounded from the battlefield, at least in the Union
Hmm,
armies. Uh, Now, did that mean your chances of survival were better? Not necessarily, but at
hmm,
least you might get to a surgeon before you die of system-wide gangrene.
hmm,
So I think that was the major advance of the Civil War, but probably only in the Union armies. Now, actually, I have to qualify that a little bit. In the Confederacy during the Civil War, there was a hospital built in Richmond,
hmm,
Virginia, Chimboro Hospital, that was an innovative arrangement of pavilions that provided good ventilation,
hmm,
a limited number of people in any given ward,
hmm,
and perhaps and following basically the tenets of Florence Nightingale,
hmm,
who
hmm,
wrote some of her principles immediately
hmm.
preceding that war. And so maybe the nursing care, maybe the general welfare of the patient was better,
Mhm.
probably not dramatically so, but we begin to have an understanding of what good hospitalization requires and what good nursing care requires, and that's very important.
Mhm.
Um, and probably there were some other examples in the north as well in terms of hospitalization, but the actual treatment of surgical treatment of wounds, there was not a lot. I mean, the major tool that doctors had, surgeons had in the Civil War was the saw in terms of doing amputations. That was probably the only thing they could do to salvage a patient. There was
Mhm.
no surgery on the abdomen to repair
Mhm.
colon or intestines. There was no surgery in the chest. People
Mhm.
would certainly die if that was attempted.
Mhm.
Plus, there's very limited use of general anesthesia. But amputations were, I mean, most military casualties in combat that
Mhm.
are survivable are extremity wounds only.
Right.
Most wounds to the trunk, chest, abdomen, head, usually fatal,
Mhm.
especially in those days. So the people that did survive, that made it to a hospital, probably had extremity wounds. And the surgeons in both the Civil War and the Revolutionary War were very quick to amputate, and fortunately so, because if they did not,
Mhm.
these wounds would certainly become infected, and gangrene would do in the patient eventually. So I would I guess I'd pick the Civil War only because I would hope I'd get better nursing care, but uh, I don't think there's a whole lot of difference. Now, the interesting thing about the Revolutionary War was it was it was the South and the climate of the South that did in the British Army.
Mhm.
You know, they didn't invade the South until 1780, I believe, when they were just kind of at a stalemate in the North. You know,
Mhm.
Washington had kind of uh, 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 kept them at bay. They never really did make much headway.
Mhm.
They won battles, but lost battles, and they never just did. They never did break the will of the colonists. So they thought they would go into the South, which actually they knew that the South harbored more what they called loyalists
Mhm.
than patriots.
Right.
And they thought what they would do is come into the South and recruit the loyalists and basically mount a civil war of its own right there and bring the colonists to their knees. What they encountered was the climate of the South and the diseases of the South, which even though they won a battle here and there, number one, they were never able to recruit enough loyalists to make
Mhm.
any difference. And number two, they were almost hamstrung by diseases affecting their armies. And eventually, they retreated back and got cornered in Yorktown, and the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah. Um, I, where you were talking earlier about amputations and the saw being sort of the main, uh, let's call it weapon of the surgeon during the American Civil War. Um, I remember I had an interview a long, long time ago with Sarah Hadley Cousin, who wrote a book about Civil War medicine, and we both talked about the one episode of Mercy Street. I think it was on PBS a few years ago of like this hospital in Alexandria, Virginia. And there's this one scene where they actually do an amputation of like, and the guy has like they're looking through the book of instruction of like, okay, you do this, you do that, you do that. And the saw is
Really?
really only the last stage for the bone
Yeah,
cutting. And
right.
it's compared so well with like one of the first movies sort of that I remember watching as a kid was Dances with Wolves.
Oh, yeah,
And that
yeah.
opening scene again where he's in the hospital and the guy's like the surgeon takes a break so he keeps his leg and like there it just seems like they're just chopping, they're cutting at it.
Yeah, well, I mean, amputation is a pretty brutal. I mean, it's pretty much what you might imagine it to be. Now, the Civil War surgeons, in the Civil War, there was a form of general anesthesia called ether and chloroform,
Hmm.
and that did produce general anesthesia. The patient was, in fact, unaware if it could be done correctly, and if they
Hmm.
had it.
Right.
Um, but for these Civil War surgeons, some of these amputation guys were just amazing. They could get this thing, they could take a leg off in less than a minute. And I can't imagine how they did that because the ones I have done, it has taken longer than that. And of
Mm,
course, we are much more meticulous now than they were then. But
mm,
there's some major bleeding that can occur if you're not careful. And you're
mm,
right. The last structure you get is bone, and you've got to saw through it, and it's not easy.
mm.
So
Yeah. Ooh, no, thank you. I'm there. There's no way I
yeah,
come into the OR ever.
yeah.
Uh, but the other part where you talked about like the kind of like trunk of the trunk of your body is that when you get hit there, I want to say I don't remember when, but it's years ago I read an article and I want to say it was in the Atlantic of a doctor writing about gunshot wounds today and sort of like how even today if you get shot into the abdomen that yes we can fix some of it but there's a lot of side effects that you will encounter that you might have to have like a bag into which your
Hmm.
feces
Hmm.
goes and
Hmm.
stuff so it's like it seems that even today with the advances that we have made an abdomen gunshot wound is still a very not like I mean, you're not
Very,
dying, but it still has a huge impact on you.
it's a very serious injury, and even during the Second World War in 1941, 45, abdominal a soldier shot in the abdomen and undergoing surgery, there is sometimes a 1 in 4 chance they would die of their wounds. Now that's not the way it is today, but it was still a kind of a tricky operation. And so
Mhm,
certainly in the Civil War, there was just no expectation that you were going to
mhm,
operate on somebody with a gunshot wound to the belly or the
mhm,
chest. Now, many of these wounds, I mean, some of these guys survived because the wounds just didn't enter the abdominal cavity or
mhm,
injure the intestines.
mhm,
They were just basically muscle wounds that the soldier would recover from. But there was no thought of even trying an operation to repair. These people were just kind of put aside and allowed to quietly die.
mhm. Oof.
So, and the same applied in the Revolutionary War. I mean, you weren't, but here's the thing about both of those conflicts. There were far more people that died of camp diseases and
I was
so
just
forth
gonna
than
ask that. Yeah.
died of combat injuries. Enormous number of people died. In the South, the problem was that once the call went out for recruits, there were a lot of willing Southern boys,
Mm,
but a lot of these people, and these weren't, just like in some of the more recent military conflicts,
mm,
the rich and influential managed to dodge
mhm.
service.
Yeah.
Or if they did, they went in as a senior officer and really didn't mingle much with the troops. Well, at least in camp life, most of the soldiers came from small towns, small farms,
Mm,
or some of the larger cities. The ones that came from farms in the rural areas had never been exposed to things like
mm,
measles and smallpox and some of the intestinal disorders and maybe not even the periodic fevers.
mm,
And they got into camp and
mm,
you packed them into tents. There was very little regard for sanitation and where you had your eliminations and where you cooked your food. And pretty soon, these boys with no immunity would get drastically sick, and many
mhm,
of them died before they even fired a shot.
mm,
And there was one comment made that in military service in the Civil War, 1 day was spent in combat and 20 days were spent in camp.
mhm,
So you're spent a heck of a lot more time sitting by the fire with your buddies, and pooping nearby
mhm.
than you do, loading and firing your rifle.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's incredible to see those numbers of how many don't die in combat. It's just the
yeah,
like
now it's
camp life
so
that kills you.
Yes, it's so different today, of course, but
Hmm.
with a better understanding of sanitation. And some of those principles were developed in the Civil War as well. Um, so the actual treatment of combat wounds made very little progress, but maybe evacuation from the battlefield by
Hmm.
ambulance or proper methods of sanitation did make an impact going forward after that.
Yeah. Now, as we draw here to the close, since I want to keep this at just about an hour and a half of conversation, there was one very interesting irony that I saw in your book that, and you have a chapter where you talk about the different maladies that people have with typhoid and malaria and diarrhea and all
Mhm.
that. And in sort of the course of all of that, you kind of talk about the planters and how the planters in the summer months to avoid sort of especially the rice planters on the coast or Sea Island cotton planters, they don't want the malaria that affects their plantation environment. So they leave it and they go to the
Mhm.
cities like Charleston or
Mhm.
Savannah. And of course, there's yellow fever. So it
Mhm.
seems like, regardless of where you
Mhm.
went, you were going to hit by something.
That's true. And in the these planters, these large farm owners, plantations are basically just large farms. In Kansas, we have wheat fields, wheat farms that are thousands of acres. We don't call them plantations; we call them, farms. So, but in the South, it was a plantation, and these plantation owners, because of the problems during the summer and the fever season, as they called it, they would hightail it to either cooler parts of the state or the area. um, any elevation would probably help. Drier air, a little cooler. The other thing they found interesting was that they sought refuge in some of the woodlands, say in Mississippi, before Mississippi was heavily forested until it was cleared and cultivated. And the advantage, as it turned out to be, in going to the woodlands was that they were free suddenly of the stagnant, sun-soaked waters that bred mosquitoes. And in the woodlands, they were isolated from that and they kind of escaped that danger, at least for a period of time until the hot season passed and they could return to the lowlands. So yeah, they took off. They knew that climate made a difference. And in fact, in that respect, it did. It did. And getting isolated, getting away from the people that are getting bit and infected and fevers and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, that
Yeah. The privilege of wealth, right? I mean,
yeah.
yeah.
Of course, I mean, I could turn this around and be like, so you're not in Mississippi right now, even though it's getting hot down there.
It's already hot. It's in the 80s, and I'll be down there in a couple of weeks or a week
Oh,
and a half. It'll be in the 90s. It's already
hot and humid.
hot and humid. As you know, you
Yep,
spent some
been
time
there.
in Louisiana. Yep.
I did not enjoy summer school. That was painful. That heat and humidity by 9 o'clock in the morning. Oof.
Yeah, yeah. It doesn't cool off much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it does not. But at this stage, I think we kind of gave the audience a great overview of sort of all the pieces of your book, and there's a lot more details in there that we can't touch on because it's just like almost 200 pages of very interesting
Yeah.
material that you're
Well,
putting into it. So,
well, thank you. Thank you.
um, but always like to remind at the end here that this was Thomas Helling's Sickly Vapors, Disease and Doctoring in the Old South, which came out with the University Press of Mississippi. And of course, if you need a surgery, he also works at the medical school of Mississippi in Jackson, Mississippi. So if you want to have a famous author as your surgeon, that's where you want to go.
Very flattering. Very flattering. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Tom.
Thank you for inviting me.